Well, this is a podcast.
Here we are.
Here we are. Here you are.
Here you are.
I mean,
you're not here, but like you're
like on
here.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We all understand each other now.
I hope so.
Yeah. So we kind of have like an unlikely topic today.
Yes.
On sort of like unlikeliness, I guess.
Yeah.
But we were kind of like discussing this question about like unlikely combinations.
Yeah.
You know?
Like what are you had?
Yeah, things that like you wouldn't think go together well, but end up working quite well.
Yeah. And we initially started talking about it in regards to food, as most of our pre-questions relate to in some way, shape, or form. But like this could apply to anything. It could apply to like music. It could apply to just various, pretty much any other spectrum of things that shouldn't work together.
Yeah.
But do. Do you have any weird combinations?
Usually like the food combinations that don't work well, I kind of like agree with. Or like some people put some kind of combination together. I'm like, no, I'm not.
You're not about it?
I'm not about that. You know?
Yeah.
So like a lot of people put like ketchup in their craft dinner, right? And
right.
I'm like, I'm not about that.
Okay.
Put that ketchup in there. You know, I'm not a big ketchup guy to begin with, anyways. So like that's like something that I kind of think doesn't work.
Okay.
You know, there's that caramel and cheese popcorn mix.
Oh, that one, the
Chicago. Yeah, close.
It's the same idea. You know?
New York, New Jersey, what?
San Francisco popcorn fix.
Yeah. So there's that, and I like that mix, but I honestly don't like eating them together. Like I'll kind of like I'll do some like cheese ones for a little while. Like actually, I'll probably try and pick those out first, just so that I could leave the caramel ones to last. Because like that's kind of different. But something that I did not think would go well together, and I had this at a restaurant one time, was blue cheese and steak.
Okay, I think I've heard of that like a little bit.
Yeah,
I've never had it myself.
So it had sort of like this crusted blue cheese on the top of it, and you cut into it, and you get some with every bite. But it's just sort of like everything worked together so well with that. So that was something that I thought worked out very well.
Okay.
An unlikely combo that just hit it out of the park.
Just somehow worked, you know? I think I've had a few things. I find that like the weird combinations that I really enjoy, like these like people already do, you know? Like I'm a big fan of like peanut butter and banana sandwiches, which like if you think about it, like it's a weird mushy fruit and like peanut butter. It's kind of weird, but like it's the Elvis sandwich. It's good. I grew up on it.
Oh, okay.
But like the thing that I do that I guess gets the most like angry or confused reactions from people is I always put salt on my watermelon. Like I've had people like visibly angry with me for putting salt on the watermelon, and I don't know why I like it. My grandfather showed me it like when I was really young, and like I can't stop doing it. Like I find that like it brings out the flavors so much more. So like that's I guess my weird combination. I don't know. It could be a normal thing. Maybe like everyone does it, and like it's normal. But
it's funny because like I think like the peanut butter and banana, like that's like normal to me.
Yeah.
But like this whole salt and watermelon, I don't know. But you know, I mean, apart from this week, you know, summer weather is coming. Grab yourself a watermelon and shake some sea salt on it, and see how that goes. Let us know if you've tried it. Let us know if you have any unlikely combinations that you like.
Or that you want us to try. Because, I mean, like, we've had, peach pizza here on the podcast beforehand.
Yeah,
so.
Which I went out to Spruce Grove one day to a fancy pizza place. It's called Love Pizza.
Okay.
And they had a peach pizza on the menu. I was shocked.
I guess it's not that weird.
I guess
it's already a thing.
We thought we discovered it, so apparently it's out there. But we came to that idea independently.
We did. So we should get profit.
Yes.
From this.
Yes.
Love Pizza. If you're listening, we want a cut from just your pizza sales.
For putting that out there, and for giving a shout out to your store. Yeah. So if you're ever out in Spruce Grove.
But yeah, if you have any weird food combinations or things that you love that we may never try, let us know. And if there's some like really kind of obscure ones, we might try some later on. We'll see what we hear.
Big emphasis on might. So
hey, I will most likely try
Ryan's
some.
Open to it though.
Yeah.
So a lot of times what we do is kind of talk about D6.
Yes.
Kind of sit down, kind of go through like what the lessons were, and try and use that as something to talk about in the podcast. And we had kind of done that. We'd kind of gone through there, and we had quite a few to kind of like choose and go through, and kind of looking at the themes of them or the characters. And so we had gone through the life of Moses for a little bit, and right now we're looking at Acts. And so there was a couple on Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And his life and his conversion, stuff like that. And we started kind of like noting some of the similarities between like Moses and Paul, and kind of really taking that and seeing that kind of all over the scriptures, right? And talking about how God calls and uses people throughout the Bible.
Yeah.
Right? And so with God, he usually tends to defy expectation. Yes. That's what we were noticing throughout his call of leadership throughout the Bible.
Yeah, we could really notice it when it came to people like Moses and Paul. Like, you're looking at their whole life story for the past few weeks. Mm-hmm. But when we looked at them, as well as some of the other leaders and major hitters throughout the Bible, a lot of those people, when you look at them from where they started or where what they were at, they look kind of unqualified. Yeah. Like if you were to kind of like see them in like the middle of like a crowd or something, and then God's like, hey, that person's going to do this amazing thing for me. You'd be like, are you sure?
You'd be going, I don't
wrong
know
person,
about that. Yeah.
You know? So that kind of got our brains going a little bit. And we wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about that idea of just defying expectations with who God's chosen through the Bible, and kind of how that impacts our lives today.
Yeah. So we want to take a look at some of the characters in the scripture who looked unqualified, right? And talk about how some of those unqualifications or disqualifications are kind of perceived today, right? So who's the first one that we looked at?
So the first person we went through was Moses, and that was primarily due to just D6 order and when we saw them first. But also he's one of like not the first, but one of the first people that are really major you think of.
Yeah, well, and he's like a major character in like the history of Israel, like in the Jewish story, right? Like when Jesus was transfigured, right? He was with Moses and Elijah, right? So even before that, right? Like he wasn't with Abraham or Isaac or anything like that, or Noah or something like that, right? Like he was with Moses. So we have this like huge character and huge leader, kind of like really setting up like the first 5 books of the Bible too, exactly. The law of Moses, right? Which ultimately comes from God. But, so we have this like major leader and major figure within the scriptures, and yet had these undertones in the beginning of being unqualified. Yeah, and like when you looked at him, you didn't look unqualified from the outside, but what really stood out to me was how he viewed himself. This specifically took place in a conversation he had with God right before he worked to try and get his people out of Egypt. And Moses really saw himself as unqualified. He had this whole discussion about how he wasn't the right person. Yeah. I'm not the one that's supposed to be leading the people. He's talking to God about this. And I think that's a thing that really applies today. This idea of the way you view yourself and the way that you view your own qualifications. Yeah, so in that passage where God calls Moses, it's in the burning bush, and it's either Exodus 2 or 3. I think it's Exodus 3. I think so. And it's just like Moses ends up kind of offering kind of like excuse after excuse. It's like, well, what if they don't listen to me? And like, who should I tell them is sending? Like, I don't even know who's sending me. Kind of like, he's really trying to kind of weasel himself out, and kind of the climax of that calling is where Moses sees his slow speech, and he says, like, I'm not an eloquent speaker.
Yeah.
As disqualifying. And this is something that he's taking inventory of his weaknesses, right? And how often do we do that? And how often do we see that in ourselves, right? Where we're like, okay, for me personally, right? Like, I'm not great with numbers. I'm not very detail oriented, and yet, I'm in a position that like requires me to try and like think through details, and it's like a little bit more difficult for me, but it doesn't disqualify me, And if we were to just kind of sit there and think about kind of like our own perception of what we see as our weaknesses, well then, yeah, like we wouldn't rise to any occasions, right? So there has to kind of to be this sort of like offering up these perceptions of weaknesses, so that God can work around it, and He does in the life of Moses.
Yeah, I think one of the crazy things about the way that we kind of react to that in our own unqualifications, if we're calling it that way, an excuse that often kind of comes up is like, well, God can't use me because of this.
Yeah,
like He's not going to be able to. There's going to be a barrier because of what I'm unable to do. And the weird thing is that God didn't put that barrier there. We're trying to put this barrier in between us. Like you're saying, like Moses' slow speech, God's like, yeah, that's fine. Have Aaron. Aaron's going to come here and he's going to help you out through it. Like he's going to speak for you for these
Moses'
people.
Brother, right? And
it's just like, it's so cool to see how Moses was like, well, no, I can't do this. There's this barrier. You're not going to be able to use me. And God's like, I don't care about this barrier that you're putting up. We're going to go around it. I still want to use you.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a thing to think about too, is these barriers that we're putting up are often us putting them up.
Right.
And I don't think we should be, because God can use us no matter how we view ourselves and what we think we're unqualified to do.
So sometimes what we need to do is focus on what our qualifications are, right? Rather than focusing on what we think disqualifies us, or, those perceived disqualifications, right? Because when you look at Moses, when you look at his upbringing, he lived as a prince.
Yeah.
He lived sitting at the feet of teachers who were teaching him systems of world government, systems of leadership, right? And he got a front row seat of what it meant to, I mean, like, obviously, like, there was oppression involved in that, but he got to learn how to balance resources, or be diplomatic, or, make judgment calls, because he was watching like the world's leader, like the leader of the, not free world, but, the leader of the world at the time, kind of like making these leadership decisions. And he would become someone who would need to step into that leadership position, right? And so you kind of like, you almost look at Moses on the outside and you're like, dude, you're qualified for this. Like, you got this, man. And yet in his own mind, he had perceived these barriers, right?
Yeah. So that was Moses. We had a quick little look at him. The next person that we looked at was Paul. And while Moses is like, his barriers were something he was putting up because of how he viewed he was disqualified, or how he viewed that he wasn't good enough, the real thing that I think we can learn from Paul is that our past mistakes don't define what we can do in the future. Yeah.
So even though you may seem like unlikely for what God is calling to you, that's not something that can stand in the way, right? So we have Paul, by his own admission, like, killing Christian, right? He's an enemy of Christianity, right? And how can an enemy of God, be someone who God can use, right? And so Paul experiences this conversion, right? He goes from having a reputation of killing Christians, and really setting out that as his mission, right? And he encounters Jesus, and he is transformed. So even though, like, Paul seemed unlikely, God's grace removed that as a barrier, right? And that's what God does for all of us, right? When you have things in your past, when you have sins in your past, right? Colossians says that our sin kind of puts an enmity between us and God, right? Because we're living, against God's created order, and actually bringing kind of destruction and hurt and brokenness and chaos to God's beauty and order, right? And that's those are the consequences of sin, right? So we throw that word out, but it actually has some pretty dire implications, right? And when we bring that to God's world, there is an enmity there, right? And so when we accept God's grace through Jesus, right, God ends up qualifying our present, right? From that moment on, you get to step and move into God's future that he has for you, right? And I like the way that 2 Corinthians 5 verse 17 says, therefore, since you have received Christ Jesus, you are a new creation. The old is gone and the new has come, right? So you can put your past behind you. You can put the unlikeliness of your connection to God behind you, because that connection has been restored, and you get to move forward, right, in the present and not in the past. Your new creation newly qualifies you in God's service.
And I think a lot of people kind of get that first step. Like they get there where, okay, I've been forgiven for my sins. Like God loves me. I can be on that side. But I think that a lot of people think that they're limited after that. I think that there's this kind of like this false perception that if you want to be used by God, you have to be perfect. That if you want to be making big differences for him, you have to be this all-star Christian, never struggle with anything, never had a problem in their lives, been a Christian since they were 2 years old, like went through, got a master's in divinity, like all of this huge thing. Yeah. And people often look at themselves and I think that they go, well, I can't be used because I was here before. I've made this mistake. I was far from him. I struggled in this area. That shouldn't stop you. Yeah. I think that a lot of people view it as, okay, well, now I'm on the Christian team. I'll sit in the corner, I'll wear the Christian shirt, and let everybody else do their big moments. Yeah. God can use you too. And I think that that's one area where that grace really, you're not just like, hey, I'm no longer separated from God, I'm on his side. No, you can be used. Right. Paul went from an active persecutor of the Christian faith to one of the biggest supporters, biggest influences in spreading of the gospel. Yeah. And that can happen. I mean, probably not the exact same way as Paul was. Like, hopefully don't go blind on a road, but you never know. Maybe that's where God's called you. But you do huge things no matter what your past had and no matter what mistakes you may have made before.
And throughout Paul's writing, like you see him talking about his weaknesses, right? And actually, when you bring up a good point about kind of like not being perfect, right? Because actually this journey that we're on is being newly created every day, right? Like newly transformed every day in our minds and in our hearts as we grow closer and connected through Christ, right? And so Paul would talk about his weaknesses and say, like, listen, it's not about my weaknesses; it's about God's strength. Yes, despite my weaknesses, right? And a part of that is like weaknesses that we carry from our past, but God is going to continue to newly create those and continue to newly overcome those in your life as you continue to be transformed by God through Jesus.
Yeah. So those are kind of examples in Paul and in Moses' life where they seemed unqualified. But in both situations, it was kind of referencing unqualifications we can view of ourselves. And I guess the next thing that we wanted to talk about is this kind of like the societal view that is often also there that could make us be viewed as unqualified. Yeah, that worked in English.
Right. So like oftentimes, like when you get people together, there's sort of like a collective mindset, right? And sometimes like that societal limitation, or it's sort of like an imposed disqualification based on sort of like prevalent views that are within like society or a culture or something like that, right? And so we see this kind of, right throughout the scriptures.
Basically everywhere.
Yeah. So like one of the people that you brought up was Rahab, right? Yeah. Who was Rahab?
So she was a prostitute, but she helped the early Israelites, I want to say, she was almost like a little inside spy, is the best way I could kind of describe it. She saved the lives of Israelites, but from the outsider's perspective, she was just a prostitute that no one would have looked at second time.
So there would kind of be this sort of tendency to like disregard her, right? And yet she played a big role in God's purposes, right? Yeah. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, you guys can correct me out there, I'm pretty sure she was, because of that action, like she was rewarded for that and kind of rescued and brought into Israel.
She's included in the Hebrews Hall of Faith.
Also, I believe within Jesus' genealogy.
Yes. Yeah.
So, boom, like big one right there. Like, huge so thing. Like society tends to kind of look down on her profession, her chosen path, and yet God redeemed her and used her, right? So this is sort of like an imposition that God used and she overcame, right? Another sort of like imposition that I was thinking of, or sort of like a limitation, is in the life, and there's a couple of them. Like so we have like Matthew, who's one of Jesus' disciples. He was a tax collector. We also like think of like Zacchaeus, who's in the same position. He was a chief tax collector, so he's like a tax collector's tax collector. And this is like my goodness, like think of something like someone or something like something that like fills you up with hate and rage, and then there you have the tax collectors, right? So just like despised by everybody, and the reason being is because like Israel believe themselves to be like called to be like separate and sovereign, and they were under Roman leadership, and so there's this kind of like collective need to kind of like band together like against this imposition, this oppression, right? And yet if you are a tax collector, you're kind of working for the enemy, right? And so there's like, how could someone who like betrays our people like serve our people, right? And then God ends up calling Matthew as one of his disciples, and so writing one of the Gospels. Zacchaeus ends up being transformed by Jesus, and ends up kind of like making restitution for his deception, right? And kind of in that way, not necessarily a disciple because he doesn't go on and follow Jesus, but ends up like talking about how Jesus transformed his life, right? So there's kind of like some societal impositions that should have kind of limited what they could do for God, and yet didn't.
And it also doesn't even have to be your job. Like one of the big people that I think of in regards to this is David. And that might be because I came from a small town farm kid. But David was this small shepherd boy that took down a giant. Like when everybody in like the military were freaking out, not sure how to respond to it, he's like, I got this. God's going to use me. You look at that story, David doesn't seem like the likely person that's qualified to take on this fight, but he was used, and he was used so much more throughout his entire life.
Right.
That's one of the big stories I want to hit on.
Kind of sets him up, right, for so much more. But I was kind of trying to look up David's age at the time that he took on Goliath, and a lot of people are saying couldn't have been more than 20, because that was sort of like a military the age, so he was under that, and was likely kind of in his teens, right, and takes down a giant. But I mean, that kind of brings us to probably one of society's kind of like biggest impositions or limitations, right, is age. Right. And oftentimes we see God working beyond that. And there are quite a few instances in Scripture where we see God doing that, seeing God work beyond those limitations.
Yeah.
Right?
You can see so many examples of that. Like we were talking about the disciples. I think we looked it up. The average age of the disciples was in their 20s somewhere. Yeah. You look at Paul's instructions to Timothy as he was to go and lead people. He was also in his rough 20s. Yeah. I think you mentioned Jeremiah was one of the big ones where he was a major prophet, and he was like 13 to 16, somewhere around there.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people thought. And I mean, in a lot of these instances, like you could go to Jeremiah and kind of like early on in that book, like in his calling, like this is something that Jeremiah actually volunteers as something to disqualify him, right? He's like I'm too young, and God's like, no, do not let them tell you that you are too young to serve me, right?
Yeah.
And then Paul's instruction to Timothy is like don't let people tell you that you're too young. Like I've worked with you. You are qualified, you know, to, and he's writing this letter because Timothy is a leader in this church, right? And so he's giving Timothy this instruction to lead this church and saying your age is not disqualifying you from this, right? And then again, we just sort of like can like discern the age of the disciples, right? And there's a bit of a range there, but all of them are fairly young, you know, not older than Jesus, who's 30 years old. You know, one was married, so he was old enough to be married, and a lot of them are the equivalent of high school dropouts in Israel, because they weren't, you know, according to the society, like qualified to go on learning about their societal structure, right? The law of Moses and stuff like that, right? So so they had kind of like been overlooked by like society and placed limitations on them, like age or whatever they didn't achieve, and yet God's like, no, like you're going to do this. Yeah, you're gonna rise to this call.
And I think what's interesting about that is we often can view ourselves as, well, I'm too young, and that's me speaking as a early 20s person working around, but
I don't know if I say that anymore.
Yeah, that's fair. But I think it's easy for people to be like, well, like I'm young, we're young, so God can't use me fully because like of my age. Age didn't disqualify these people throughout Scripture. Right. They weren't like, well, I mean, David, we want to use you, but you're too young, so wait for 10 years and then come on back. Or Jeremiah being like, hey, I want to use you, Jeremiah, but come back when you're 30 and then we'll use it then.
Hey, give me 20 years, you know, and I'll...
Yeah, age didn't disqualify these people, and I think in the same way it shouldn't disqualify people today. Yeah. We shouldn't look at people and be like, well, you're young, can't do anything yet, wait until you're done. Yeah.
So a lot of you guys watching out there, this is like your age is not a limitation to how God can use you, right? And I guess sort of like in that sense, you know, God is calling you to do something for Him, to serve Him, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you what that is. That's something you and God need to figure out. But He is calling you to to talk to your friends about the gospel, to serve in the church, to go on missions, to play your instruments, to lead, you know, and your age doesn't disqualify you from those things, right? I know this is something that I've kind of talked about a lot, but this is the book Do Hard Things. It's an audiobook format right here, but we have a paperback, and you could listen to it for free online through things like Overdrive is an app that you can get that through. If you want to come and borrow it, we would love for you to lend that to you so you can check that out. But it's a book that talks about like removing that barrier of age, right? Yeah. And I mean, it talks about like society sometimes doesn't expect enough from our young people, right? We sort of expect you guys like to be lazy and, I don't know, play video games and just kind of not do much with your lives, right? And that's sort of a weak expectation. And so this book is kind of talking about how you can kind of upend that expectation and rise to the occasion of qualification that God is calling you to and qualifying you for, right? And part of that is just sort of choosing to be challenged by that, right? There are a lot of things that I still need to learn about following God, about leadership, about ministry, right? But I'm not stopping that from, getting in there and doing that, right? And challenging myself. And that's something that you guys can start right now and set yourself up for inviting challenge in your life and just growing to become great influencers for the gospel of Christ, right?
Yeah. And you found a quote also, I believe you were talking to me about.
Yes. So I was, and this kind of a way to kind of wrap all this up, right? So I came across this quote from A.W. Tozer this week. I'm just going to kind of read it off the board here. But God is looking for people through whom he can do the impossible. Mm-hmm. What a pity that we plan only things we can do by ourselves. And I think it's talking about that ability, that power of God to qualify us.
Yeah.
Right? When we were talking about this, God qualifies the unqualified, right? So even though we have these perceptions of ourselves, even though we have past mistakes and failures, and even though, you know, society may limit us in what they expect of us, right? God can do the impossible through that. And sometimes we just need to not limit ourselves in those ways.
Yeah.
And we can be qualified for the work of God.
Yeah. Cool. So long story short, like, don't try and find barriers as to why God might not be able to use you.
Yeah.
God doesn't see those barriers.
Yeah.
He uses the most unlikely people to do the most extraordinary things, and he can use you too.
Yeah. So, love if you like the podcast and subscribe to it so you know when these episodes are coming out, and make sure to comment, about something that you may have liked in the show, or want to ask about what we've talked about today, or even just sort of like an unlikely combo that you like. Ryan and I are an unlikely combo, so
that's true. I didn't think about it that way. Okay, like that.
It might be because we're too similar. I don't know. So, but
that's a scary thought.
I know. But so we'd love for you to do all those things, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the podcast.
Yeah.
Bye
forever.
Like, do a medium one or
do a range.
Okay.
That way you can.
That hurt my hand.
That hurt my ears.
Yeah. That was okay. The cut. I might keep that though.
The gross burp? No.
I think that might stay in there.
I hope that it came through on. You started that, right?
Yes.